When Maria Martinez got the call that her daughter had been fired, she couldn't stop shaking. Sophie was 22, working 2 jobs to finish college. The manager said she'd caused a disturbance. But what really happened? Sophie had stood up to 4 customers harassing a 10-year-old girl in the store. The girl's mother? A woman in leather who made grown men step aside. When Elena Russo learned that a stranger had been punished for protecting her daughter, she made 3 phone calls. By sunrise, 340 motorcycles would roll into that Georgia town. What happened next would prove that when systems fail the courageous, justice doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it arrives on 2 wheels. The first insult cut through the store like a knife. Sophie Martinez heard it from 3 aisles away, where she was restocking shelves at the Savamart in downtown Pinewood, Georgia. She was 22 years old, in her senior year at Georgia State studying social work. Working 2 part-time jobs to cover tuition her student loans didn't, surviving on 4 hours of sleep most nights and coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The retail job paid $9.50 an hour and required her smile at customers who treated her like she was invisible, to bite her tongue when they were rude, to remember that she needed this paycheck more than she needed her dignity. But some things mattered more than keeping quiet. Before we go further into Sophie's story, I want to ask something from the heart. If stories of courage, of ordinary people standing up when systems fail, if moments that restore your faith in humanity means something to you, would you consider subscribing? We bring you real stories of kindness and bravery that remind us good still exists in this world. A like, a share, your support helps us reach more people who need hope. Thank you for being here. The voice that cut through the store belonged to a woman Sophie would later learn was named Diane Pierce, a regular customer whose husband owned 3 car dealerships and whose sense of entitlement had been cultivated over decades of never hearing the word no. She stood in the toy aisle with 3 other women, all of them dressed in expensive athleisure, where that cost more than Sophie made in a week, all of them surrounding a 10-year-old girl who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Does your mother know you're dressed like that? Diane's voice carried across the store, loud enough that other customers turned to look. That jacket is completely inappropriate for a child. What kind of parent lets their daughter walk around looking like she belongs to some gang? Sophie stopped restocking, her hands freezing on the box of cereal she'd been placing on the shelf. She couldn't see the confrontation yet, but she could hear the tone, could recognize the particular cruelty that came from adults who'd learned they could say anything to anyone without consequence. The little girl's voice, when it came, was small and shaking. My mom gave me this jacket. There's nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong with it. Another woman laughed, harsh and mocking. Sweetheart, leather jackets with those patches. That's biker trash. Is your mother biker trash? Is that what you are? Sophie moved before she'd consciously decided to, her feet carrying her toward the confrontation with the same certainty that had driven every major decision in her life. She'd grown up watching her own mother, Maria, work double shifts as a nurse, sacrifice everything to provide opportunities Maria had never had, teach Sophie through exhaustion and determination that you stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. That lesson had cost Sophie before, cost her friendships, cost her comfort, cost her the easy path through life that came from keeping your head down and minding your business. But she'd never been able to walk away from injustice, even when walking away would have been smarter. She rounded the corner into the toy aisle and took in the scene. For women in their 40s, expensive handbags hanging from their arms, faces arranged in expressions of disgust as they circled a 10-year-old girl who clutched a small leather jacket decorated with hand-sewn patches. The girl had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, big eyes filled with tears she was fighting not to shed, and the kind of quiet dignity that came from being different and knowing it, from facing mockery before and surviving it but never quite getting used to the pain. "Excuse me," Sophie said, her voice professional but firm as she stepped into the circle, positioning herself slightly between the women and the child. "Is there a problem here?" Diane turned toward her with a particular smile wealthy people reserved for service workers who'd forgotten their place. "No problem. Just having conversation. You can go back to your stocking." It didn't sound like a conversation, Sophie said quietly. It sounded like 4 adults harassing a child. The temperature in the aisle dropped 10 degrees. Diane's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of cold fury that suggested she wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone wearing a Savamart vest and name tag. Excuse me? I don't think you understand your position here. We're customers. You're an employee. I suggest you remember that before you say something you'll regret. Sophie felt her heart hammering, but kept her voice steady. I'm an employee, which means I'm responsible for making sure everyone in this store feels safe. And right now, you're making this child feel unsafe. So I'm going to have to ask you to either complete your purchase or leave. What Sophie didn't know about the little girl she was protecting would change her life forever. But first, she'd have to survive the next 10 minutes. The confrontation escalated with the speed of a match touched to gasoline. Diane's face flushed red with rage that came from a lifetime of never being told no, of wielding her husband's money and her position in the community like weapons that cut through any resistance. I want to speak to your manager. Right now, do you have any idea who I am? Who my family is? You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic minimum wage life. Sophie stood her ground, even as her stomach knotted with fear, because she knew exactly what this was, knew exactly where it would lead. She'd seen it before, had watched powerful people destroy others for less. You're welcome to speak to my manager, but you're still going to need to stop harassing this child. The little girl, Elena Russo, looked up at Sophie with an expression of shock and gratitude that mixed with fresh tears. No one had ever stood up for her like this before. No adult had ever put themselves between her and cruelty, especially not a stranger who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Diane pulled out her phone, her fingers stabbing at the screen with fury. We'll see how brave you are when you're unemployed. We'll see how much you care about doing the right thing when you can't pay your rent. The manager, Gerald Thompson, arrived within 3 minutes, summoned by Diane's call directly to the store owner, bypassing every level of authority to reach the one person who could make immediate decisions based on who spent the most money. Gerald was 48, had worked retail management for 20 years, and had learned the fundamental truth of American capitalism. The customer is always right, especially when the customer's family represents $50,000 in annual purchases. He listened to Diane's version of events, nodding sympathetically, his face arranged in an expression of professional concern that barely masked his calculation of what this confrontation would cost. He didn't ask Sophie for her side, didn't ask Isabella what had happened, didn't ask the other customers who'd witnessed the harassment to verify who'd started what. He just looked at Sophie with disappointment that felt rehearsed. Sophie, I'm going to need you to clock out and come with me to the office. The conversation in the manager's office lasted 7 minutes. Gerald explained that Savamar valued all its customers, that Sophie had created a hostile environment by confronting Mrs. Pierce, that her behavior was unprofessional and unacceptable. Sophie tried to explain that she'd been protecting a child from harassment, that the women had been cruel and inappropriate, that someone needed to stand up for basic human decency. Gerald cut her off with the tired patience of a man who'd had this conversation before and knew how it ended. I'm sorry, Sophie, but we have to let you go. Mrs. Pierce is a valued customer. Her family spends more in this store in a month than you make in a year. I can't afford to lose that business because you decided to play hero. She was harassing a 10-year-old, Sophie said, her voice shaking now with anger and fear and the dawning realization that standing up was going to cost her everything. A child. And you're firing me for protecting her. I'm firing you for insubordination and creating a disturbance. Clean out your locker and leave your vest and name tag at the front desk. Sophie walked out of Savamart 20 minutes later, her small box of personal belongings clutched against her chest, her mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. She'd lost one of her 2 jobs, lost income she desperately needed, lost the ability to pay rent next month, to cover her car insurance, to stay enrolled in the classes she was 3 months from completing. She'd stood up for a child being harassed, and the reward was unemployment and financial devastation. She sat in her 15-year-old Honda in the parking lot and let herself cry, great shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest, from the exhaustion of working 2 jobs while going to school full-time, from the stress of being 22 and feeling like she was drowning, from the injustice of a system that protected wealthy bullies and punished poor people who dared to do the right thing. If you've ever stood up for someone and paid the price for it, you know what Sophie felt in that moment. Comment, courage, if you believe protecting others matters more than protecting yourself. Because what Sophie couldn't know was that her courage was about to be answered with something extraordinary. The phone call to Maria Martinez came at 2:15 in the afternoon. Sophie sat in her car, still parked outside Savamart, and dialed her mother's number with shaking hands. Maria answered on the second ring, her voice already tight with concern because Sophie never called during work hours, never interrupted her mother's shift to the hospital unless something was seriously wrong. "Sophie? What happened?" "Mom, I got fired." The words came out broken, followed immediately by sobs she couldn't control. "I got fired for standing up for a little girl, and now I don't know what I'm going to do." Maria's response was immediate and fierce. "Where are you?" "Stay there. I'm coming." Maria arrived 30 minutes later, still wearing her nurse's scrubs, having told her supervisor there was a family emergency and left mid-shift without clocking out. She found Sophie in the parking lot and pulled her daughter into a hug that felt like safety, like home, like the one constant in a world that kept proving it didn't care about people like them. Sophie explained everything through tears. The harassment, the confrontation, the manager's decision, the implications of losing income she needed to survive. Maria listened, her own anger building with each word, her face growing harder as she understood what had happened. Her daughter had done the right thing and was being punished for it. The wealthy women who'd harassed a child would face no consequences. The system had failed, again, in the way it always failed people who had no money, no power, no influential friends to make phone calls and fix problems. "We'll figure this out," Maria said, holding Sophie's face in her hands. "You did the right thing. Don't you dare regret protecting that child. We'll figure out the money. We'll figure out everything. But you did the right thing." But figuring it out felt impossible. Sophie had rent due in 2 weeks, car insurance, student loan payments, books for next semester. She was 3 months from graduating with her social work degree, 3 months from being able to get a real job that paid more than minimum wage, 3 months from having opportunities her mother had never had. And one act of courage had potentially destroyed all of it. The call from Savamart's corporate office came that evening, not to apologize, but to inform Sophie that they were updating her termination paperwork to include aggressive behavior toward customers, language that would make it nearly impossible for her to get hired anywhere else in retail. Diane Pierce had made additional complaints, had threatened to sue the company unless they documented that Sophie had been the aggressor, that she'd created an unsafe environment. The corporation folded immediately, protecting their bottom line and their relationship with a high-spending customer by destroying a 22-year-old's employment prospects. The system was failing Sophie in real time. But there was one parent who hadn't been contacted yet. One mother who didn't accept that wealth bought immunity from consequences. If this makes your blood boil, if you're sick of systems that protect bullies and punish courage, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next proves that justice doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it rides in on 340 motorcycles. That evening, as Sophie sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment she shared with her mother, trying to calculate how long her savings would last and coming up with answers that terrified her, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Sophie Martinez? This is Elena Russo. You protected my daughter Isabella today at Savamart. I need to see you. May I come to your home? It's important." Sophie stared at the message, her first instinct to say no because she didn't know this person, because letting strangers in her home felt dangerous, because she'd already paid enough for getting involved. But something in the message felt different, respectful, urgent. And the mention of Isabella, that little girl with tears in her eyes and a leather jacket she defended so fiercely, made Sophie hesitate. She texted back her address. The knock came 30 minutes later. Sophie opened the door to find a woman in her early 40s standing in the hallway, wearing a black leather jacket with patches Sophie didn't recognize, jeans, boots, and an expression that mixed fierce determination with something that looked like tears barely held back. "I'm Elena Russo," the woman said quietly. "Isabella's mother. May I come in?" Sophie stepped aside, and Elena entered the small apartment carrying a bouquet of sunflowers and an envelope she clutched like it contained something precious. She saw Sophie's red eyes, the exhaustion, the defeat, and her own face crumbled slightly. "Isabella told me everything," Elena said, her voice shaking with emotion. "She told me 4 women surrounded her in the store, said terrible things about her jacket, about me, about our family. She said you stepped in, told them to stop, protected her when you had every reason to walk away. And they fired you for it. Sophie nodded, not trusting her voice. Elena set the flowers down and looked Sophie directly in the eyes. You protected my daughter. You didn't know her. You didn't know me. You just saw a child being hurt, and you stood up. That makes you family. And family takes care of each other. She handed Sophie the envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. Sophie's hand started shaking. I can't accept this. I didn't help Isabella for money. I just did what anyone should. That's exactly why you're accepting it. Elena interrupted gently. Because you did what anyone should do, but almost no one actually does. You sacrificed your job, your income, your financial security to protect a 10-year-old from cruelty. And I'm not going to let that sacrifice destroy you. This covers your rent and expenses until you find new work. Non-negotiable. Maria had been standing in the kitchen doorway, watching this exchange with wide eyes. Now she stepped forward. I don't understand. Who are you? Elena smiled, sad and determined. I'm the treasurer for the Southern Georgia chapter of a motorcycle club. We're a brotherhood, a family that protects those who can't protect themselves. Your daughter showed more courage in that store today than most people show in their entire lives. And the system punished her for it. The manager sided with wealth over justice. The corporation sided with profit over principle. Well, they're about to learn that some things still have consequences in this world. Sophie felt something shift in her chest, hope fighting through the despair. What are you going to do? Elena's smile became something fiercer. Tomorrow morning, I'm paying a visit to Savamart. Not for violence, for accountability. Some people need to understand that protecting bullies because they spend money isn't acceptable. Will you trust me? Sophie looked at this stranger who'd walked into her life with sunflowers and a check and a promise of justice. Looked at her mother, who nodded slightly. Looked at the envelope in her hands that represented breathing room, represented the possibility that doing the right thing wouldn't destroy her after all. What are you going to do? Sophie asked again. I'm going to show them what real consequences look like, Elena said quietly. I'm going to make sure you get your job back with a formal apology. I'm going to make sure those women understand that harassing children has consequences. And I'm going to teach this town that justice doesn't always wear a suit. Elena made 3 phone calls that night. By dawn, something this small Georgia town had never experienced was about to roll down Main Street. The first call went out at 8:30 that evening, after Elena had left Sophie's apartment and returned to her home on the outskirts of Pinewood. She sat at her kitchen table, still wearing her leather jacket, and pulled out her phone. The contact list read like a map of Georgia, names and numbers of people who'd ridden together, stood together, protected each other through decades of brotherhood that went deeper than blood. She started with Marcus Webb, the vice president of the Southern Georgia chapter, a man she'd known for 15 years, a veteran who understood injustice in his bones and had made it his life's work to stand against it. Marcus answered on the second ring. Elena, what's wrong? A 22-year-old woman protected my daughter today, Elena said without preamble. 4 wealthy women were harassing Isabella in a store, saying terrible things about her jacket, about our family, calling us trash. This young woman, Sophie Martinez, she works retail, making minimum wage. She's in college trying to finish her degree. She stepped in and told those women to stop. Defended a child she didn't know because it was the right thing to do. There was a pause. And they fired her. Elena's voice hardened. The manager sided with the wealthy customers. The corporation backed him up. They're even putting false accusations in her file to make sure she can't get hired anywhere else. She lost her job. Marcus. She's 3 months from graduating college, and she lost her income because she protected my 10-year-old daughter from harassment. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with controlled anger. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was quiet and dangerous. What do you need? Everyone who can ride, Elena said. Tomorrow morning. Dawn. We're paying a visit to Savamart corporate headquarters and the store where this happened. Not for violence, for accountability. We're going to show them that punishing courage while rewarding cruelty has consequences. We're going to get Sophie her job back and make sure those women understand that harassing children isn't acceptable just because you have money. How many do you think we can mobilize? Marcus asked. Everyone, Elena repeated. Call Atlanta. Call Savannah. Call every chapter within riding distance. Tell them a young woman showed more courage than most grown men we know, and the system is destroying her for it. Tell them we're standing up for someone who can't fight corporate power alone. Tell them family takes care of family, and Sophie Martinez is family now. I'll make the calls, Marcus said. We'll be there. The second call went to Atlanta, to Raymond Torres, chapter president and Iraq War veteran who'd come home with shrapnel in his leg and a bone-deep understanding that protecting the vulnerable was the only thing that really mattered. Elena laid out the situation in straightforward terms, explaining what had happened, what the store had done, what she was asking. Raymond's response was immediate. We're in. I can have 90 riders ready by dawn. This is exactly what we should be doing, standing up when corporations crush people for doing right. The third call went to Savannah, to Carmen Silva, a chapter treasurer who happened to be a labor rights attorney in her civilian life and who understood workplace retaliation better than most. Carmen listened to Elena's story, asked pointed questions about the termination paperwork and the false accusations, and her voice when she responded was fierce with professional outrage. That's illegal termination and defamation, Carmen said flatly. They're opening themselves up to a massive lawsuit. But I know how this goes. A young woman with no resources can't afford to fight a corporation with lawyers on retainer. So we make them understand consequences they can't ignore. Count us in. I'll bring everyone I can, and I'm bringing documentation of every employment law they violated. Sometimes justice needs witnesses. Word spread through the brotherhood like electricity through a wire. Chapter calling chapter, brothers and sisters reaching out across networks that connected them, the communication moving with practiced precision. Marcus called his contacts in Metro Atlanta. Raymond reached out to smaller chapters in surrounding counties. Carmen activated the Coastal Georgia network. Each person who heard the story made their own calls, sent their own messages, reached out to their own circles. By 9:30, confirmation messages were flooding in. By 10:15, the count had reached 180. By 11, 240. The number kept climbing as word spread, as people heard about a 22-year-old college student who'd been fired for protecting a child, as they learned about wealthy women who'd harassed a 10-year-old and faced no consequences while their victim lost everything, as they understood this was exactly the kind of moment that required them to show up, to be counted, to make their presence felt. By midnight, 340 riders had confirmed they would ride at dawn. From 3 Georgia chapters, plus independent riders who heard through the network and wanted to be part of something that mattered, they would converge on Pinewood, a town of 8,000 that had no idea what was coming, that had no framework for understanding what it meant when brotherhood mobilized to protect someone the system had abandoned. In garages and driveways across Georgia, motorcycles were being fueled in darkness. Men and women pulled leather jackets from closets, checked patches, prepared for a ride that would start before sunrise, and end with a message that couldn't be misunderstood. These weren't outlaws or criminals. These were construction workers and teachers and business owners and veterans. People who worked hard, paid taxes, raised families, contributed to their communities in visible and invisible ways. People who'd chosen to be part of something larger than themselves, who'd sworn oaths to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, who believed that brotherhood meant showing up when it mattered. They prepared not for violence, but for justice. Not to harm, but to hold accountable. Not to threaten, but to demonstrate that wealth and corporate power didn't give anyone the right to destroy someone's life for doing what was right. In Pinewood, the Savamart manager Gerald Thompson was at home, believing the situation was handled. Diane Pierce was comfortable in her large house, confident that her family's money had protected her from any real consequence for harassing a child. The Savamart corporate office had closed for the day, executives comfortable in the knowledge that they'd protected their bottom line. Maria and Sophie Martinez sat in their small apartment, hoping that Elena Russo's promise meant something real, but not daring to believe it fully, because systems had failed them too many times before. And across Georgia, 340 motorcycles prepared to roll. If you think most people assumed 340 bikers meant violence, you're right. They were about to learn something completely different. Comment, justice, if you believe actions should have consequences, no matter how much money you have or how much power your corporation wields. The rumble began at 5:52 in the morning, distant at first, like thunder rolling across the Georgia hills. That low, persistent growl that precedes a storm, the kind of sound you feel in your chest before you consciously hear it. 340 motorcycles converging on Pinewood from 3 different directions, their engines creating a symphony of raw power that built steadily, inevitably, unstoppable. From the north, the Atlanta contingent rolled down Highway 41, 97 bikes in tight formation, headlights cutting through pre-dawn darkness. From the east, the Savannah chapter approached on Route 80, 83 riders maintaining careful spacing. From the south, Elena Russo's Southern Georgia chapter brought 160 motorcycles through back roads, their presence announced by that distinctive rumble that carried for miles. They converged on Pinewood with military precision, each group arriving at predetermined points, waiting for the signal to move forward as one unified force. The coordination was flawless, the result of years organizing charity rides and memorial processions and events that required dozens of riders to move together safely. Gerald Thompson, the Savamart store manager, arrived at work at 6:30 for inventory review. He parked in his spot near the employee entrance, coffee in hand, his mind already running through the day's tasks. He'd slept well the previous night, unbothered by having fired Sophie Martinez, comfortable in his decision to side with his highest-spending customers over a minimum-wage employee who'd forgotten her place. He was unlocking the back door when he heard it. That rumble, growing closer, impossible to ignore. Thompson stopped, keys frozen in the lock, and turned toward the sound. At first he saw nothing. Then the first headlight appeared at the intersection, then another, then 10, then 50, then the entire street filled with motorcycles. His coffee cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the pavement. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone and called his district manager. "We have a situation at the store. There are hundreds of motorcycles. I don't know what they want, but they're surrounding the building." "What do you mean motorcycles?" The district manager's voice was sharp with confusion and rising panic. "Hundreds of them. Bikers. They're filling the parking lot. Send help. Call corporate. Call someone." Police were dispatched within minutes. 3 patrol cars representing Pinewood's entire on-duty force. They arrived to find exactly what Thompson had described. 340 motorcycles filling the Savamart parking lot and surrounding streets. Riders standing beside their bikes, in complete silence. The officers assessed, radioed back to dispatch. No disturbance. No threat. No weapons visible. No laws being broken. Just presence. What happened next will be talked about for decades. Because Elena Russo didn't come for revenge. She came to teach a lesson about consequences. At precisely 7 o'clock, as if responding to a signal only they could hear, 340 engines cut simultaneously. The silence was deafening, heavy with expectation. The only sound was the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal and Gerald Thompson's panicked breathing as he stood frozen by the back door. Elena Russo dismounted slowly, deliberately. She removed her helmet, set it carefully on her seat, and began walking toward the store entrance. Behind her stretched a formation that looked like something from a dream or nightmare, depending on which side of justice you stood on. 340 men and women in leather vests with patches, American flags on handlebars, faces of every age united by a code that valued honor and protection. Early morning shoppers arrived, expecting a normal Thursday, instead finding streets filled with motorcycles and an atmosphere charged with potential. They stopped, uncertain whether to enter the store or leave, whether to witness what was clearly about to unfold or flee from something they didn't understand. Elena reached the entrance and stopped. She didn't speak immediately. The silence and 340 people behind her spoke volumes. Thompson appeared at the glass door, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Mr. Thompson," Elena said, her voice calm and unshakable. "I'm Elena Russo. You fired Sophie Martinez yesterday for protecting my 10-year-old daughter from harassment by your customers. I'd like to request a meeting with you, your district manager, and corporate representatives. We have something important to discuss about employment practices, about who you choose to protect, and about the consequences of punishing courage while rewarding cruelty." It wasn't really a request. Everyone understood that. Thompson looked at the formation behind Elena, looked at the police who'd made clear through their inaction they saw no legal grounds for intervention, and realized he had no choice. "I'll make some calls," he managed. Within 90 minutes, the Savamart district manager, A corporate HR representative and a regional vice president had arrived at the store, driven by panicked phone calls from Thompson and instructions from corporate headquarters to handle the situation. They gathered in the store's conference room, a windowless space usually reserved for staff meetings, while 340 bikers waited in the parking lot with a patience that was somehow more threatening than any aggression could have been. Sophie Martinez arrived with her mother and Elena at 8:30, escorted through the crowd of riders who parted respectfully to let them pass. Sophie's eyes were wide, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people who'd shown up, who'd ridden through the night for someone they'd never met. The meeting began with corporate attempting to take control, the regional VP starting with practice corporate speak about unfortunate misunderstandings and reviewing our procedures. Elena cut through it with surgical precision. "Let's be clear about what happened," she said, her voice hard. Sophie Martinez witnessed 4 customers harassing a 10-year-old child. Verbal abuse, age-inappropriate comments, harassment that made my daughter cry. Sophie, your employee, did exactly what any decent person should do. She intervened. She asked the customers to stop. She prioritized a child's safety over customer comfort. And you fired her for it. The HR representative started to speak, but Elena continued. Then, because that wasn't enough, you added false accusations to her termination paperwork. Aggressive behavior toward customers. That's defamation. That's deliberate sabotage of her future employment prospects. That's illegal retaliation for protected activity. Carmen Silva, the Savannah chapter's attorney, slid a document across the table. I've documented every employment law violated in this termination. Wrongful termination for refusing to ignore harassment. Retaliation. Defamation. The lawsuit would be substantial. But we're not here to sue yet. We're here to offer you a chance to make this right. The corporate representatives exchanged glances, their practiced calm cracking as they realized this wasn't going away with standard procedures and carefully worded apologies. What do you want? The regional VP asked carefully. Sophie gets her job back with a formal written apology, Elena stated. Full back pay for the time she's been terminated. The false accusations removed from her file and replaced with documentation of her courage in protecting a child. A written guarantee that she'll face no retaliation. And a company-wide policy change that employees are not only permitted, but encouraged to intervene when they witness harassment of minors, regardless of how much money the harasser spends in your stores. The VP looked at the district manager, who looked at Thompson, who looked at the floor. The customers in question are very valuable. The customers in question harassed a 10-year-old child. Elena interrupted. Your choice right now is simple. You can do the right thing, reinstate Sophie with the terms I've outlined, and implement policies that protect children in your stores. Or you can refuse, and we'll be here every day. 340 of us. Perfectly legal. Perfectly peaceful. Standing in your parking lot from open to close. Informing every customer who walks in about how this corporation fires employees for protecting children while rewarding customers who harass them. We'll organize a boycott across 3 states. We'll contact every news outlet in Georgia. We'll make this the defining story of your brand. Your choice. The silence in that conference room was absolute. Corporate power, wealth, carefully crafted policies and procedures. All of it meant nothing in the face of 340 witnesses who wouldn't be intimidated, bought off, or made to go away quietly. The regional VP took a breath. We'll need to consult with legal. You have 30 minutes, Carmen said, sliding her business card across the table. I'm an employment attorney. Your legal team can call me if they want to discuss how this plays out in court versus how it plays out with you doing the right thing. Clock's ticking. 23 minutes later, the decision came back from corporate headquarters. Sophie Martinez would be reinstated immediately with full back pay, formal written apology, file correction, and guarantee of no retaliation. Savamart would implement new company-wide policies protecting employees who intervene in customer harassment of minors. The 4 women who'd harassed Isabella would be banned from all Savamart locations. When Elena walked out of that conference room and gave the thumbs up to the 340 riders waiting in the parking lot, the cheer that went up could be heard 3 blocks away. If you're furious that it took 340 bikers to get basic justice, subscribe to this channel. Because what happens next proves that standing up still matters, that ordinary people can defeat corporate power when they stand together. But Elena wasn't done. She'd gotten Sophie her job back. But that was just the beginning. She promised to teach this town a lesson about consequences, and the lesson wasn't complete. That afternoon, at 3 o'clock, Elena organized a community gathering in Pinewood's town square. 340 bikers stood alongside townspeople who'd heard what happened and wanted to be part of something that mattered. Sophie and Maria stood in front of the crowd, still processing the whirlwind of the past 24 hours. Elena addressed the crowd with a voice that carried across the square. Yesterday, Sophie Martinez lost her job for protecting my daughter from harassment. Today, she got that job back because 340 people believe that doing the right thing should matter more than protecting corporate profits. But we're not just here to fix one injustice. We're here to make sure it doesn't happen again. She reached in her vest and pulled out an envelope. The Southern Georgia Brotherhood, along with our chapters from Atlanta and Savannah, has established a scholarship completion fund for Sophie Martinez. She's 3 months from graduating with her degree in social work. We're covering her remaining tuition, books, and living expenses so she can finish without working herself to exhaustion. Because courage like hers deserves support, not punishment. The crowd erupted in applause. Sophie stood with tears streaming down her face, Maria's arm around her shoulders, both of them overwhelmed by the generosity of strangers who'd become family. We're also donating $50,000, Elena continued, to establish a community fund that provides emergency financial assistance to workers who lose their jobs for standing up against harassment, discrimination, or injustice in the workplace. Because Sophie's not the only person who's ever been punished for doing right. She's just the one we're making sure doesn't stand alone. More applause, louder now, people beginning to understand that this wasn't just about one young woman or one incident, but about changing how the community responded when systems failed. And finally, Elena's voice hardened. We're putting the business community of Pinewood on notice. We've sent a letter to every major employer in this town. It's simple. If you punish employees for protecting children, for intervening in harassment, for choosing human decency over profit, we'll know about it. And we'll be back. Not for violence. For accountability. For making sure that doing the right thing doesn't destroy people's lives. She paused, letting that sink in. Diane Pierce and her friends who harassed a 10-year-old child. They're here today. 4 women stood at the edge of the crowd, their presence demanded by Elena as a condition of resolving the situation without further escalation. They looked small now, stripped of the power that came from wealth and social position, forced to stand publicly and face what they'd done. You harassed a child, Elena said, looking directly at them. You used your money and your position to avoid consequences. You thought that because you spend money at Savamart, you could say whatever you wanted to whoever you wanted. You were wrong. The 4 women stood with faces flushed, unable to meet anyone's eyes. You're going to apologize to Isabella, Elena said quietly. Right here, right now, in front of everyone. And it's going to be real. Because 340 people rode through the night to make sure you understand that money doesn't buy you the right to hurt children. Diane Pierce stepped forward, her hands shaking, her voice when it came barely above a whisper. Isabella, I'm sorry. What I said to you is cruel and wrong. You didn't deserve to be treated that way. I'm deeply sorry. The other 3 followed, their apologies halting and uncomfortable but genuine in the way that public shame extracts genuine remorse. Isabella, standing beside her mother, nodded slowly, accepting their words with a dignity that suggested she understood this moment was bigger than her, that it was about changing how people in power treated those without it. And you're going to apologize to Sophie, Elena continued, for getting her fired, for making her pay for your cruelty. The apologies to Sophie came next, each woman acknowledging that their actions had cost a young woman her livelihood, that their sense of entitlement had real consequences for real people. Sophie accepted each apology with grace, though her eyes were hard, understanding that these women were sorry they'd been held accountable more than sorry for what they'd done. But it was something. It was public. It was witnessed. It was a record that couldn't be erased. The catharsis in that town square was overwhelming. People who'd witnessed injustice and stayed silent felt the weight of their inaction. Business owners who'd prioritized profit over people began reconsidering their own practices. In Pinewood, Georgia, A town of 8,000 that had functioned on the assumption that wealth insulated you from consequences, learned that some things still mattered in this world. Sophie Martinez graduated 3 months later with her degree in social work, her final semester funded by the Brotherhood Scholarship, her grades improving because she could focus on studying instead of working 2 jobs. She graduated summa cum laude, walked across that stage wearing a small pin on her gown, a gift from Elena, a miniature version of the chapter patch that meant protected by family. She got a job immediately after graduation in a nonprofit serving at-risk youth, work that paid a living wage, and let her use her degree to help kids who reminded her of Isabella, of herself, of everyone who'd ever needed someone to stand up when standing up cost something. Elena became her mentor, teaching her about advocacy and systems and how to fight institutional power without losing yourself in the process. Elena Russo and Sophie became close, the 10-year-old looking up to the young woman who protected her, Sophie seeing in Isabella the kind of courage that comes from surviving cruelty and choosing not to become cruel yourself. They met for lunch once a month, Sophie listening as Isabella talked about school and friendships and dreams, offering guidance that came from someone who remembered what it felt like to be different, to be targeted, to need protection. The community fund Elena had established helped 43 workers in its first year. People who'd been fired for reporting safety violations, for refusing to participate in discriminatory practices, for standing up when standing up cost them their jobs. The fund provided bridge financing, legal support, and connections to employment attorneys who worked on contingency. It transformed how workers in Pinewood understood their options when faced with retaliation. Savamart implemented the policy changes nationwide, not just in Georgia. Employees across the country received training on intervention protocols when witnessing harassment. Corporate policy now explicitly protected and rewarded employees who prioritized customer safety over customer satisfaction. The change wasn't perfect, wasn't complete, but it was real, measurable. One young woman's courage had reshaped policy for a corporation with 1,200 stores. The Brotherhood launched the Stand Up initiative 6 months later, a program designed to support workers who faced retaliation for doing the right thing. It provided legal assistance, financial support, and advocacy for people fighting wrongful termination, workplace harassment, and corporate retaliation. To date, the program has helped 1,847 workers across the country. People who stood up and paid the price, who needed to know they weren't alone, who deserved support instead of abandonment. Diane Pierce and the 3 women who'd harassed Isabella became cautionary tales in Pinewood, their names mentioned in hushed tones as examples of what not to do, of how wealth didn't protect you when you crossed certain lines. Their social standing never fully recovered. The public apology, witnessed by hundreds and recorded on dozens of phones, followed them in ways money couldn't erase. Gerald Thompson, the Savamart manager who'd fired Sophie, was quietly transferred to a different store after customer complaints about his judgment increased following the incident. The district manager who'd initially supported the termination found himself passed over for promotion when corporate reviewed his decision-making history. Systems changed slowly, imperfectly, but they changed. Because 340 people had shown up when it mattered, had demonstrated that justice sometimes required presence, required witnesses, required people willing to stand in parking lots and town squares and say, this matters, this person matters, and we're not leaving until it's made right. Elena Russo stood in front of a community center in Pinewood 6 months after that morning when 340 motorcycles rolled into town. She was speaking to a group of young people about advocacy and courage, about standing up when systems fail, about understanding that one person can make a difference but nobody has to stand alone. People see the leather and think danger, she said, her voice carrying to the back of the room. They see the patches and the motorcycles and the brotherhood, and they make assumptions based on movies and stereotypes and fear of what they don't understand. But when you really look, when you get past the surface, you see people who remember what it means to protect. You see men and women who won't let courage go unrewarded or injustice go unchallenged. You see a family that believes some things still matter in this world, that standing up for children matters, that protecting the vulnerable matters, that using whatever strength or resources or presence we have to make sure the innocent are safe matters more than comfort, more than convenience, more than fitting in. She paused, looking at each young face. As long as we're around, people like Sophie will never stand alone. Sophie stood up when it mattered. 340 riders stood up for her. Now it's your turn. Subscribe if you believe in protecting those who can't protect themselves. If you think courage like Sophie's deserves support instead of punishment. If you believe that one person standing up can change everything when they don't have to stand alone. Comment stand up if you refuse to let bullies win. Whether they're schoolyard bullies or corporate bullies, or anyone who thinks wealth gives them the right to hurt others without consequence. Your comment isn't just words. It's a statement, a moral stance, a declaration that you're on the side of the vulnerable and you won't stay silent. Share this story with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Maybe it's someone who's been fired for doing the right thing. Maybe it's someone facing retaliation for standing up against injustice. Maybe it's someone who's forgotten that courage still exists, that systems can be changed, that ordinary people can defeat institutional power when they stand together. Because courage doesn't need permission. Courage doesn't wait for ideal circumstances or guaranteed outcomes, or someone else to go first. Courage lives in a 22-year-old working minimum wage who saw a child being harassed and decided that mattered more than her paycheck. It lives in 340 people who dropped everything to show that doing right would not go unanswered. And it lives in you if you choose to stand up when your moment comes. Stand up. The world is watching, and you're not alone.